So I want to start a new series looking at the book of Acts, which the full title would be Acts of the Apostles. And so we're going to go through the entire book. This particular lesson will be just an introduction as we lay the groundwork about the author, the time it was written, some of the events, an outline of the book, and so forth. And in the next lesson, we'll actually kind of get into the details, into the text, and so forth. So this, like I said, this lesson will be pretty much dedicated to an introduction to the book of Acts. So, of course, the book of Acts is as it sounds. It talks about the activities of the apostles, understanding that the book of Acts begins where the Gospels end. The Gospels end with the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the Acts of the Apostle kind of picks up the story from there in terms of what happens to and with the apostles, who of course was that immediate circle of followers and believers of Jesus Christ after the resurrection. Why is it important? Why is it important for us to look at the book of Acts? Well, first, of course, it's in the Bible as part of the canon, which means it was a book that was circulated, that was studied, that was revered by the emerging church, and of course still is today. And what it does is, by looking at the book of Acts, we get an idea, we get a glimpse at the way God was acting in history as the church emerged following the resurrection of Jesus. And while God might not seem to act in the same way as he did then, if you look at accounts of how God is moving in other parts of the world outside of the United States, where there is oppression going on, where there's a limit to the number of Bibles that are available, there are limits to the way that God can reveal himself to people, that he is still acting in many of the same ways. And of course, we hear accounts even in this country of healings and visions and things like that, where God still is just as active today as he was back then, even if we don't see it in our immediate circle. There are wide varieties and many accounts of ways in which God is revealing himself in the world today. And so we do need to be sensitive to the way in which the Spirit of God moves in our midst, whether it be here in our communities and our own families, perhaps, but around the world, and open and sensitive to the fact that he is still active in the world. And this is one of the reasons why we are encouraged to continue to pray and look for his engagement and his involvement, because of the love that God has for us. And of course, best benefited by what had occurred right before these activities that we're going to be reading about in Acts, in the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So after the resurrection, we know that or actually before the resurrection, the apostles, the followers of Jesus, were completely demoralized. Obviously, they had great hopes for what was going to be occurring, the coming of the kingdom, Jesus assuming the throne, overthrowing the Romans, establishing his kingdom on earth, and all this. And of course, it didn't happen. He was killed. And so they went into hiding. And then, as we read in the Gospels, of course, they discover the empty tomb, and they actually have a physical encounter, multiple physical encounters with the risen Christ. And of course, the Great Commission is given to them, to go throughout the world and preach the good news, which is what the word gospel means. of what this means. It's the dawn of a new era here on earth and with humanity. And so the book of Acts tells us, as these apostles, these followers of Jesus now go out, to spread the word. And of course, they're gonna face opposition, in some case fierce opposition, in some case persecution, in some cases actually in all of the apostles eventually, except for John, they're going to face martyrdom. And so this was not going to be an easy mission whatsoever. But the stories in Acts do show that God and Jesus is faithful to his promise to be with us always. And he was, even again, as these men spread the message, and even to the point of death. And so they can be an encouragement to us that no matter what we face today, and although the persecution, the slander, the mockery, whatever Christians face, the denigration in today's culture, we don't face what they faced. Now, there are people, there are believers, there are Christians throughout the world, in different parts of the world, that are facing a very similar kind of opposition, to the point of physical opposition and even martyrdom. But we in America, what we face pales in comparison, obviously, to what was faced by those early Christians. But whatever we do face, we can be encouraged by what they faced and how they faced it. So just kind of going back very quickly, when Adam and Eve rebelled in the Garden of Eden, God began a rescue mission. When they rebelled, what occurred was what we know as the fall into sin, and the curse that came not only to Adam and Eve and to mankind thereafter, but really to the creation in general, to the whole world, even to the universe. Where things began to degrade immediately, and death came into the world, and so forth. But God immediately, at that point, established a process, and he began, as it says here in the first bullet, a rescue mission that would take, of course, time. But he established a plan of salvation that was going to roll out over time, because he wanted to be reconciled, to the world that he created, and the beings, the creatures that he created as well. And his intention was obviously for us to have fellowship with him forever. But in order for that to happen, there was a sin problem that had to be taken care of. And so again, as the book of Acts opens up, the plan has been executed, in the sense that Jesus was executed. And of course, his execution on the cross atoned for our sin. Jesus as man could die, and as God, his life had eternal value, infinite value, and therefore his atonement had infinite value to it, to the extent that it could cover the sin of mortal beings. The infinite God, in essence, atoning for finite beings. And again, that's, in terms of the transaction, because we are finite, his infinite life being sacrificed could cover the cost of any number of finite beings who needed to be atoned for. And so he did. And so the book of Acts really is now the unfolding of taking that message, to the world. God chose us as vessels to carry out that mission. He doesn't just kind of write the message in the sky, or he doesn't thunder from the mountain like perhaps he did with Moses, and of course frighten the people to the extent they said, tell him not to do that anymore. No, God uses human beings, and so what he does is he reaches individuals and then tries to reach other individuals through them. So he takes the message out through people. And the apostles and the early disciples was this first group who was to take the message out to the world eventually. But to start obviously with their own communities, their own circle. So again, at the end of all the Gospels really, and we're going to talk about Luke in a minute, but at the end of the Gospel of Luke, Jesus gives the commission, and he says basically, you are witnesses of all these things that occurred. You were witnesses of my ministry. You're witnesses of my miracles. You're witnesses of my triumphal entry. You were witnesses at the Last Supper. You are witnesses of my crucifixion, but you're also witnesses of my resurrection. And this is the good news that you need to take to the rest of the hurting world. And so here again, and this is a quote obviously from Acts, the first chapter and the 8th verse, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, which of course was the area there in surrounding Jerusalem, and to the ends of the earth. Now, obviously, the folks who were sitting there hearing him say this, they were not going to go to the ends of the earth, but their message would. And so it would start in Judea and Samaria, but eventually the word of God, this gospel was going to spread, and has been spread, to the ends of the earth. So this was very prophetic in terms of what Jesus said. So the story of the church, the Christian church, becomes the story of the fulfillment of God's mission to make all things new. So these disciples, these apostles are going to be sent out to deliver the message of the good news of what God has done through Jesus Christ. As far as who wrote the book, it is pretty much widely, but not universally, but I would say most scholars, certainly virtually every Orthodox scholar, believes and accepts that it is Luke that authored the gospel that bears his name. That he wrote both the gospel and he wrote the book of Acts. And of course, we're going to look at a little bit more detail, but the early church fathers attributed this gospel and this book of Acts to Luke within just years really of it having been written. That being the case, when you take just the sheer volume of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts in its totality, that represents 25% of the New Testament as a whole. Now, it's interesting that in the text of both of these books, in neither of these books does he actually mention his own name, but he is mentioned in other places. But again, there's pretty early attestation that Luke was the one who wrote the book of Acts. There are records, there are indications that he wrote the gospel while he was in Greece, that he was not married, and that he eventually died at the age of 84. He's believed to have been converted from being a pagan, basically, but may have been converted to Judaism first, and then Christianity. And he was a Gentile. And of course, that means he was the only non-Jew who was an author of a New Testament book. The implication of chapter 1, verse 2 is that Luke was not himself an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus Christ. So that's not definitive that he wasn't, but the reason this is implied is by the language where he says, inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us. Now, of course, this could very well be referring to the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, because almost certainly Mark and Matthew, both those Gospels were written before Luke, and so he would have had that. Um, so he was aware that those had been written. And so he's going to write, and he says here in verse 2, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. Of course, Matthew is an eyewitness. Mark, it is believed, and there's certainly a tradition and there's evidence that Mark was the scribe for Peter. That in other words, the Gospel of Mark is really Peter's account of the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So certainly Peter was an eyewitness. So Luke is making reference to the fact that there are accounts of these eyewitnesses. And ministers of the word delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also. So even though these have been written, but I'm also going to write an account, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account. So he's going to try and set things in more of a chronological order, whereas the other Gospels were not necessarily in a chronological order. So he's going to write about many of the same events. As we know, there's a great deal of overlap. But he's going to try and put it into an orderly account for the reader. And of course, he says, writing to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus. And we're going to talk about Theophilus in a few minutes, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. So this Theophilus was certainly aware of the teachings. And Luke is writing this orderly account for him. So as I said, Luke was the only non-Jewish author of the New Testament. In Colossians, which of course was one of Paul's letters, he distinguishes Luke from those of the circumcision, but that term of the circumcision would mean that they're Jewish. So he distinguishes Luke from those people, indicating, of course, that Luke was not Jewish. And Luke is mentioned in, here we get, I'm not going to read this whole passage. You can look at it if you want. Colossians chapter 4, verses 10 through 14. In verse 14, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. So he distinguishes Luke from the group of the circumcision that Paul is describing. He describes the Jewish folks, and then he separately makes a mention of Luke. Luke was cultured and educated as a physician, and he uses the Greek language and uses a very educated. It's very evident from his usage of the Greek language that he has this education. Really, the only one whose use of the language is as good or better would be Paul. And of course, we know Paul was very highly educated as well. Paul was a Pharisee, and he was very well schooled. So you would assume that he would be very well spoken, and that he would have a very good command of the language. Well, Luke again was very well educated. He was a physician. And so you would again expect that he would have a very refined ability with the Greek language, and it shows in his writings. He has a great acquaintance with the historical method. Again, being of the sciences, so to speak, it would not be surprising, to see that he would be able to do a methodological and organized and chronological account, put the information together in an orderly way. And he was very evidently a very careful historian. Many scholars have pointed out how careful he was. And as a matter of fact, there have been many archaeologists who have gone to this area of the world and used the book of Acts and even the Gospel of Luke, as their guideline in terms of where they're going to do their dig or where they're going to do their research and so forth, because he was so meticulous and so accurate. Now, as far as his being a physician, it is interesting to know and to note that if, as a physician, he would have gone to the academy in Rome, because that's really the only place where physicians could be educated and trained at that point in time in the empire and at that point in history. So he had to have been schooled in Rome at the academy in Rome. Not sure exactly, where his hometown was, but you see in writings that it is implied, at least, if not just speculated, that Antioch is where he was from. It was a center of Gentile missions, and again, he was a Gentile. There is some evidence, some tradition that at least at one point in time he lived in Philippi in Greece. And perhaps even was there for quite a period of time. There is some speculation that Titus, of course, we read the letter of Paul to Titus, was his brother, but that's certainly not anything in particular that we can hang our hat on. That there's nothing definitive about that, but there is some tradition, there is some writing that makes that implication. In Acts, he states, Luke does, that he remained in Philippi as Paul and Silas left on a journey. And of course, there's a point in time in which Luke is going to accompany Paul on his journey. Luke first appears with Paul at Troas in Acts 16. Of course, we'll look at that later. Here's the passage, verses 10 through 12, where the pronoun that he uses switches to we, which indicates obviously that he was now part of the group that he's describing going on this missionary journey. So you can see here in verse 10 where he uses the pronoun we, and then he says sailing from Troas, he uses the pronoun we, and in verse 12 again, and we were staying in that city for some days. So again, that indicates that he was now part of the group that's traveling with Paul. And Paul at other points describes Luke as a fellow laborer, and we'll see that as we go along. Luke was a physician, and we know that Paul complains of certain maladies along the way on his journeys. It's very, very certainly likely, at least possible, but probably likely, that Luke tended to him, tended to his issues as a physician. And of course, Paul calls him the beloved physician, and I'm sure it was very nice having him along on these journeys, having a physician along. As I said, it seems that Luke, again, by this switching to the use of the pronoun we, Luke was a companion to Paul from, and this was from the point of the return of his third missionary journey back to Jerusalem until he is taken to Rome. And even at that, at one point, Paul states that really only Luke is with me. And this is at a point when Paul is in prison, and this is in Rome. And in 2 Timothy, which was the last letter that Paul wrote before his being martyred in Rome, he writes that only Luke is with me. So Luke kind of stayed nearby, visited him in prison, and so forth. And all the other companions or co-laborers or folks who had been on these missionary journeys with Paul had left by this point. Luke stuck around, and so in second Timothy, Paul makes reference to this. As it says, this last bullet, I don't know that it's important, but there are some early legends that Luke was also a painter. Not that means anything in particular. Now, when did Luke write the book of Acts? Well, the historical sequence found in the Gospel of Luke and then in the book of Acts. It seems as if the book of Acts would have been written fairly shortly after Luke wrote the gospel. This, of course, from chapter 1 in the gospel, I myself, having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, and I read this before, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. And then the very first verse in the book of Acts states, in my former book, which would have been obviously the Gospel of Luke, Theophilus, again, he's writing to this Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day he was taken up to heaven. And then, of course, he goes from there. So Luke's gospel was written probably somewhere in the mid-50s AD, with Acts written sometime soon thereafter. And the reason for that, again, there are when Acts ends, Paul Paul is in prison, okay, and there is no mention of the fall of Jerusalem. And the fall of Jerusalem, we know, as you can see from the bottom here, the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple occurred in 70 AD. A monumental event. And so it is almost certain that if this had occurred before Luke finished writing, he would have mentioned it. The other thing is obviously that Paul, at the end of Acts, is still alive. In fact, Paul is released from house arrest in 62 or 63, and he is martyred in somewhere between 64 and 68. And this is, of course, under the Emperor Nero. And of course, this is not mentioned either. So it gives us an idea that the book of Acts had to have been written before many, if not most, or all of these events had taken place. Otherwise, Luke would have written about them. Certainly the destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem, certainly about the martyrdom of Paul, and none of these things are mentioned. So it had to have been written before that, and then the gospel before that. And so these are the reasons why it is assumed that the gospel was written probably in the late 50s, no later than the early 60s. And as I said, the book of Acts ends, as it says here, with Paul under house arrest. And we know that he is released from prison, from house arrest, somewhere 62, 63. So the book of Acts had to have been written before that. So if the book of Acts was written 60, 61, maybe 59, somewhere in there, then the gospel would have been written before that. So these are the reasons why scholars place the timing of when Acts was written, let's just say right around 60 AD, give or take a little bit. To whom was it written? Well, again, Luke and Acts are both addressed to this man named Theophilus. As I said before, physicians in the empire at this point in time were all educated at the academy in Rome. It was really the only place where you could be trained as a physician. One of the other interesting facts about that day is that in many cases, a physician would be owned really as a servant. You might say as a slave, but of course in our culture, the word slave has a different connotation than perhaps it would have then, but really as an indentured servant almost. And so these elites, these aristocrats would have a servant who was a physician, who would be the family physician. Our thinking of what a family physician is, obviously a general practitioner. But in their day, a family physician was literally someone who took care of the needs of just this family. They were employed the this aristocrat, um, to take care of the family. Now, the other thing that's important is that Luke uses the term most excellent in referring to Theophilus. And it is surmised, it is thought that one of the reasons for that is that this Theophilus, again, was maybe not just an aristocrat, but may have actually been a senator or a governor or some kind of very important governmental or political figure, because this is the term that would be used to make reference to someone like that. For example, in Acts 23, we see down here, there's a letter that's written to Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix. And again, we'll talk about Felix later, but he was a governor. And again, he uses this term most excellent in referring to this governor. So it is thought that perhaps Theophilus was also himself a governor, senator, or some important figure. Books were expensive. They were, handwritten on parchments and scrolls and so forth. And so it would be common to write something like this for a very wealthy patron who would keep the writings and grant access to others to read. And so in that sense, at least, it may very well be that this Theophilus person may have financed Luke's writing, paid for the copies, and granted churches access to them as they got circulated to the churches of the day. Now, scholars believe that Acts was meant for several audiences. Obviously, it wasn't. It was written to this person named Theophilus, although it's interesting that the word Theophilus, if you break it down, means lover of God or loved of God. So there are some who suggest that, in fact, Theophilus is not an individual named Theophilus, but actually is written to any lover of God or anyone who is loved of God, so to speak. Personally, because again, he uses the term most excellent Theophilus, which is a common term used to refer to an important figure, an aristocrat or a governmental figure or whatever. It's probably likely that there was a Theophilus, but there are some who suggest that, again, this is just a word that's used to refer to a broader audience who were part of the body of believers, for example, or was an honest seeker and so forth. But it was not unusual for people like Theophilus and many in the Roman Empire who were intrigued by this new burgeoning Christianity. They were very curious about it. And of course, we know that as Christianity spread, it became more and more and more of a Gentile spread, basically, that there were Gentiles of every persuasion, really, including Romans, who were becoming believers, becoming Christians. And so, as I said, in laying out kind of this chronological, meticulously methodological account, Luke's account has proven to be very, very valuable to historians and believers, of course, and as I said, even archaeologists. It is said that Matthew wrote to a Jewish population. This is evidenced by the fact that he quotes the Old Testament more often than anybody else does. Mark wrote to Gentiles, John to the church, and that Luke was written to a very broad audience. Again, in terms of the writing of the book of Acts, the book of Acts picks up the story right after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, in this little chart here, there are some dates here, years that there is some dispute about. For example, Jesus's ministry beginning in 26 AD. Personally, I think it was more like 29, based on what the Gospel of Luke states in terms of when it began relative to Augustus. And therefore, if that's the case, then the crucifixion, death, and resurrection would have, in my view, probably been more like 32, maybe 33, and so forth. And of course, the book of Acts is going to pick the story up, as right after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So this is when the story. This is not when it was written. This is when the story picks up. Okay, that's an important distinction, obviously, and then it's going to extend. The book of Acts covers. It doesn't cover the fire in Rome. It doesn't cover the first revolt. It's going to cover, Felix is mentioned, Paul's journey to Rome and his house arrest is mentioned, his third missionary journey is mentioned. All these things are mentioned, but none of the things after this are mentioned. And so again, going back to the rationale as to why the belief is that it was written right around 60 AD is based on the fact of these things over here on the right not being mentioned, in the book of Acts. So finally, just a quick outline of the book. The first chapter, the first part of the first chapter really talks about the work of Jesus continuing. Jesus is still mentioned in terms of his interaction with the apostles in the first few verses of the book. And then it moves on to kind of as the word is being taken out now, being spread. It starts obviously in Jerusalem, and so we're going to talk about the ministry of Peter, the ministry and of course the martyrdom of Stephen, and then it starts to spread almost like in concentric circles. It is, as Jesus said, you're to spread, from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria and to the outer parts of the world, to the end of the earth, basically. And so it does go from Jerusalem to Samaria and Judea, where we're going to talk about, we're going to see the ministry of the Apostle Philip. We're gonna go through the conversion of Paul. Of course, in his letters, Paul talks quite a bit about that, but we're going to be introduced to that here in the book of Acts, and of course also the ministry of Peter as it continues. In chapters 11 through 28, we see now it's spreading even farther with the ministry of Barnabas, the conclusion of Peter's ministry, Herod Agrippa, the ministry of Paul and Barnabas in terms of Paul's first missionary journey, where now he's really spreading it out to other parts of the world. The very, very important Jerusalem Council, we'll talk about that obviously much later. the ministry of Paul and Silas, which is Paul's second missionary journey, his third missionary journey, which of course includes the author, includes Luke. Paul back in Jerusalem and Caesarea, his being taken to Rome, and obviously the gospel preached throughout the world eventually through these apostles, having its roots and its beginnings with these apostles. So Luke is obviously very, very significant and important contributor to the New Testament. In fact, he is, depending on whether Paul was the author of Hebrews or not. If he is, then Paul is the largest contributor in terms of authorship in the New Testament. If he did not write Hebrews, then by just volume, Luke was the greatest contributor to the New Testament. But either way, those two comprise a great deal of the New Testament, one being a Gentile, obviously one being Jewish. And of course, Luke was a traveling companion with Paul. Luke is considered very reliable as a historian. Again, his work being used even by secularists, historians and archaeologists and so forth. The fact that he is so meticulous with his facts, in terms of naming people, places, events, and so forth. The fact that he was so meticulous with those details gives us a greater degree of comfort that he was just as meticulous as he named and described the activities of Jesus, the words of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, and everything about Jesus. So I hope this has been helpful. It's an introduction. Again, we're going to get into the meat of the book of Acts and talk specifically, obviously, about what happened and what occurred in these in the ministry and the lives of these men as they began to fulfill the commission of Jesus to take this good news to Jerusalem, to Judea and Samaria, and to the outer parts, to the world, basically. So thanks for sticking with it, and hope that you will tune into the next video as we get into the actual Acts of the Apostles. God bless you.